I now have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Arthur K. Wheelock, who is former curator of Northern Baroque painting at the National Gallery of Art, and also former professor of 17th century Dutch and Flemish art at the University of Maryland at College Park. Currently, he is serving as the senior advisor for the Leiden collection. Today, Dr. Wheelock will reprise a role he took in our 2016 symposium and interview the well-known Belgian collector of Flemish 16th and 17th century art, Mr. Thomas Leysen. Thomas Leysen's involvement in the field of Netherlandish art is too lengthy to enumerate in our short session today, but includes chairmanships of the boards of the King Baudouin Foundation, the Rubenianum Fund, deputy director of the Friends of the Rubens House, and the advisory board of the Frans Hals Museum. A beautiful volume was recently published on the history of the historic home in Antwerp where Mr. Leysen which he has lovingly restored, the Hotel de Rosière, where much of his extensive art collection is now housed. Gentlemen?
Thank you, Louisa. Well, I'm very happy to be back together with you in this forum because we did this in 2016 at the wonderful symposium. And at that time, we got to see you and your collection and your home in a wonderful discussion in this way together on stage. So that was a very different experience. But I'm delighted to have you back at the Frick, as it were, and to come back to your collection because I know that for everybody it was such an incredible experience to see you and to hear you talk about it. That we love to have your story again, and also revisions to your story that I know have come up from that. So 3 years since 5 years. Is it 5 years now? Yeah,
almost
4 years.
So
it's been a while. Anyhow, but why don't you go ahead and start and tell us about your collection? We know that you are so active about collecting and also in the history of Antwerp, and so we'd love to hear all about that.
Yeah, with pleasure. It's as ever great talking to you. I tried to share my screen. Is that visible?
Yes, it works out perfect. Yes.
Okay. So where to start? Maybe just talk about the collection. I started as a collector maybe a bit more than 20 years ago. I was interested in art all my life long. I had the good fortune to have parents who were very interested in art, and my father was involved also with many museums and took me to many museums. And there's hardly a Gothic cathedral in Europe that I haven't visited in my childhood. But so I had been exposed to art, and when we were newly married, my wife and I, we also were interested in art, but it's only later, maybe when I was 40 years old or so, that I really started finding out that I could collect and that I also had maybe the disposable income to do so. And so originally my collection started around drawings. So my first love was really drawings and very much Flemish drawings, but also a little bit wider than that. But then I gradually graduated to paintings. And so when I thought about a focus for the collection, because there's so much I love and there's hardly anything I don't like in the broad field of old masters, I really at first decided to focus on Flemish art, on Antwerp art of the 16th and 17th century. And so on this slide, what you see is sort of the beginning point of the collection, Gerard David, which is obviously operated at a turning point between when Bruges was the preeminent center of art production in Flanders. He had his workshop there, but he moved to Antwerp later in his life, or he had a workshop in Antwerp. So Gerard David is one of the earliest paintings, and so the main body of the collection sort of ends with the followers of Van Dyck in the middle of the 17th century. So 150 years where Antwerp was such a fascinating place. And Adam just now succinctly enumerated some of the things that made Antwerp such an interesting place in that period. So that's more or less the core of the collection. It has branched out into other areas since. But the biggest part is indeed 16th century Antwerp paintings. today a bit forgotten also in museums. So names like Floris, Franz Floris, Martin de Voss, but also earlier Quentin Matsès. So that is a period I particularly love, and then obviously the 17th century with all the great names that we saw.
Right. Well, it's a wonderful bookends to your collection right there. So.
Yeah, indeed. So maybe some of the themes of the collection. It's a fairly broad collection. It's in line with my early interest in landscape drawings. I collect landscapes, some of them by relatively unusual artists, Christian de Koning. You have a beautiful one in New York, but also this painting that you see at the bottom, a rather mysterious 16th century anonymous painting, a very fine landscape, unusual format, no discernible religious motif. So a very intriguing painting. Actually, when it went to an exhibition, the curator found out that it has actually some castles which still are in existence in Naples, which are represented on it. So it's a very intriguing, very beautiful painting. So I really loved that when I saw it when it came up for auction. Maybe another big aspect of the collection is still lifes. Here, Ozias Beert, Clara Peters. Incidentally, I think two paintings that I bought at auction in New York. So indeed, it's a two-way street. Paintings going to America, sometimes coming back. But still lives is certainly another subject matter that I really like, and certainly where Antwerp was also very, very instrumental in developing the genre at the time, and certainly Clara Peters, which we've seen was apparently also much appreciated in America in those days, is one of my favorite painters.
Well, these are two beautiful paintings, and as we discussed before, which I find fascinating, these are kinds of still lives that in America, at least, were not at all appreciated. Tabletop still lives and cheese and fruit and stuff like that. Really, artists, Beert and Peters, who are not known in this country, really are collected until the late 20th century. I mean, they're mid to late 20th century. They were not part of in America, the 19th century taste, or early 20th century taste at all. So
no, and even also over here, they're not really household names. I mean, Clara Peters got her first monographic show in the Prado and in Antwerp 4 or 5 years ago, and it was a real first. It was actually also the first ever show in the Prado devoted to a woman artist. And no, I think they're great painters, but even in Europe, they are not by far not household names.
Yeah, are you interested in flower paintings or not?
Well, I hardly have any flower paintings. I like them, but I find them generally the really good ones are very, very expensive. And as a collector, you have to make trade-offs. I cannot buy everything, and I'd rather buy 3 or 4 of these paintings rather than one Bosgaard.
Okay.
So, but that's not an art historical judgment, but not even an aesthetic judgment. It is sometimes, yeah, you as a collector, you have to make these trade-offs, what you go for and what you don't. Hunting scenes. This is Paul de Voss, very, very large painting coming out of a Spanish collection, which I bought at TEFAF a few years ago. I generally, when we buy paintings, my wife and I, we make a joint decision. Drawings I'm allowed to buy on my own, but with paintings I need to get a stamp of approval, or at least I need to seek that stamp of approval. So this one was one which we hotly debated because she saw the appeal of the painting, but was sort of found it rather cruel. So I had to promise her that they made it in the end, so then she relented and let me buy it.
And she really believed you.
She really believed me. You can see it. They'll make it. They'll make it. The collection is also entering into some religious scenes, biblical paintings. Not too many, but here two paintings. Waren van Orley, a fragment of what must have been an enormous altarpiece. It's of actually really outstanding quality. It's unfortunately a fragment. This is actually a photograph before it was restored. But a very, very intriguing painting, and we've been trying to piece together the history of that altarpiece. It's been in a show recently, and some new light was shed on the painting. On the right-hand side, Joos van Clever, another early 16th century Antwerp artist, which I like very much. This one also comes from America, and so this is certainly a period that I appreciate a lot.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting part of the story, is that this moving of works of art back and forth now across the Atlantic that did not exist at all until, gosh, I don't know, the early 20th century. I mean, it was all one-way street, but now it's shifting back and forth. So it's really quite an incredible change in the market collecting mode.
No, indeed, I have to say that's been very much the case. When preparing this talk, I was actually thinking about it, and I don't have exact statistics, but at least 10 or 15% of the collection is works that I purchased in New York or that have a known provenance from U.S. collections. So there's been quite a few there that have actually made their way back, and I think it's great. I think it's great that Flemish art is spread around the world, and I don't think it's a purpose as such to bring them all back. That's first of all, it's impossible, and secondly, it would be very, very, very counterproductive. But it's sometimes nice to bring some works back to the place where they were created. So let me move to next one. Genre scenes is not something that I'm really big on. But sometimes, I mean, a painting strikes me, and I just decide, or we just decide to go for it. You see here mid 16th century or second half 16th century anonymous painting again, and on the other hand, Jan Kossier's Merry Company, or actually an allegory of the five senses. Again, it's a painting that when I first saw it, it struck me. It's so vivid, also with this man pictured from the back, this large hat. It's very daring, I think, and very, very modern. So I immediately fell in love with that. The portraits is a big part of the collection. I enjoy portraits. Maybe I have too many of them. I sometimes think, but yeah, they engage me and they speak to me. Here, Quentin Metzès, a painting that is maybe known to a New York audience because it hung in the Met for many years. I lent it whilst I was still in the process of assembling the collection, because the pendant, the woman that goes with it, is in the Met holdings, and so they were reunited for a number of years, and they will actually be reunited again next year in the Dürer exhibition that the National Gallery and Aachen are planning. So it's one of my earliest portraits. Also, Maarten van Heemskerk, a portrait of an old woman, not a Flemish painting, obviously, but again, as I said, the focus of the collection is still there, but I've increasingly moved afield, either geographically to other eras, later paintings as well, some even modern and contemporary art, but also increasingly sculpture in recent years. So it's not a fully closed collection that is only focused on that, but it still is the core of what I
Did
collect.
this woman, Heemskerk woman, have a pendant as well?
No, not that we know of. It's not very well studied. It has been suggested that it might have been the portrait of the mother of the painter, but that's not verified in any way. And actually, when it was at Maastricht and the story surfaced about this maybe being the mother of the painting, one of the journalists who wrote about it, if it was his mother, he certainly didn't like her very much. But be that as it may, no, there's no pendant. But again, there's going to be an important Heemskerk exhibition, I think, in Holland, in Haarlem, and in Alkmaar next year. So maybe new light will be shed on it.
Yeah, but you're very generous with your loans from your collection to exhibitions. Sounds like.
Yes, I'm always glad to lend within what remains reasonable, because first of all, I'm proud to be asked. I'm glad to share. And it's always an opportunity to learn more about the works of art and to learn more about the artists. So, indeed, I generally like to lend. I collect to live with the art, so I don't collect works that I systematically put on long-term loans into museums, or I certainly don't collect to put in storage or into bank vaults or into free ports. But if there's a good reason to request a painting for a show, I'm always glad to do that. Yeah,
it's great. It's great.
Here are some 17th century portraits. Then one is a portrait of the Archduchess Isabella. As this image is probably well known to many of the viewers. It's the prototype that Rubens made in his studio when she came to visit him on a date that is known, and he kept it in his studio till his death, and it was the prototype for many versions of that portrait by Rubens, by Van Dyck, and by many followers. So it's I think it's an engaging portrait. You see the degree of intimacy, I think, between the painter and the sitter, and it also has a meaning, because a special meaning in the collection, because the house where I live is just opposite a Carmelite convent, and well, the Archduchess, she planned to retire as a Carmelite nun. She didn't. In the end, she stayed on as a governess of the Netherlands. She didn't go back to the Descalzes Reales in Madrid, where she planned to retire with Rubens tapestries. But she stayed here, but she wore the habit of a Carmelite nun. And so the convent, which is just across the street from where I sit, was actually founded by her.
That's a great story. It's wonderful.
Yeah, and the nice story about the other portrait, which is a recently resurfaced Van Dyck. It had been known to various copies in the past in various parts of the world, but the original only recently resurfaced and was only published for the first time a couple of years ago. It's a portrait of the Bishop of Antwerp at the time of Rubens and Van Dyck. He didn't play a major part in art history. I don't think he was really very interested in art as such, not like the Bishop of Ghent, Trist, and others people those periods. But the nice story about this one, apart from it being, I think, a really good portrait, is that when we researched the history of the house, we delved into the archives of the convent across the street. And so the abbess of the convent, in her diary, wrote at a certain stage, "The bishop, he's always promising to come and see us, but he's never coming." And so now I hung him at the window overlooking the convent, so at least he's gotten as close as he ever did to the nuns across the street. So that's this. A specific area of interest. It's sort of happened that I was able to buy a number of portraits of collectors, and I have maybe 10 of them now of different collectors. Here, a very, I think, intriguing and beautiful portrait by Van Dyck in his late period, in his English period, and of Ewart Jabach, who, as you know, in the Met you have this fantastic Lebrun painting of him. He was not a beauty, as you can see, Jabach, but he was certainly one of the greatest drawing collectors ever, and certainly in the 17th century. He was from Cologne, but his family had an involvement with Antwerp, and he then went on to Paris. The intriguing thing is that this young man, he must have been 20 or 19 or 20 when he had this portrait made, had already this love of art in him, and went to one of the most fashionable portrait painters of the time to have himself painted, and he's done that probably 3 times. We know one other portrait in the Hermitage, which was made a year later, and but documents speak that he had 3 portraits of Van Dyck made by him. But again, I think there is a degree of intimacy between the sitter and the painter that you don't generally see in many of the English period Van Dycks, but he must have sensed an affinity of this young man for art. And then the portrait next to it is by very different by Greuze, and it's a portrait of Van Helborn, Florent Van Helborn, who was at a certain point mayor of Antwerp, but he was a great collector. He was one of the earliest great collectors of Flemish primitives. So he built a fantastic collection which he left to the Antwerp city, and which forms the core holding of the Museum of Fine Arts in Antwerp in terms of their Flemish primitives. So he collected the 7 Sacraments of Van der Weyden, the 2 Van Eycks, which are in Antwerp, the Simone Martini, the Antonello da Messina. So this was all this young man's work. And again, it's a very similar story. At 20 years old, he went to Paris and had himself painted by Greuze, who was by then 85. Again, this portrait reveals, I think, some of this self-confidence of this young man, who very early must have been determined to engage with the arts. He engaged with politics as well. He became, as I said, mayor of Antwerp. But his first passion must have been his art collection.
Okay. Well, Thomas, we're moving. We're a little bit. Let's sort of speed up our story a bit, because I think we're moving,
indeed. So let's come to the house, where, because the collection to me is very much linked to the house where I live. It's a house which we bought some 15 years ago, which we spent many years restoring. And here you see it both from the street side and from the garden side. And so this is, for me, very much, when I collect art, it is about how it fits into the house, not so much, not only or not into the house, fits into the living environment. And so I'll just very quickly show some slides here, how some of the paintings hang here in the drawing room. In the hallway, you see the Jabach painting. You'll see a few other works here in the stairway. Here, the difficult art of hanging, as I've entitled the slide, we have really recreated one room as a Kunstkammer, as you can sometimes see them on the paintings. It's been a very difficult process to that hanging, and I first had all the paintings made in posters or photographs of it, and so tried it out, but in the end it gives me much joy to think about the hanging of the paintings, and from time to time to rearrange them, at least partially.
Slides like this are always great after we've seen one by one, to actually then you get a sense of this individual scale of the various works. So it's wonderful to see them in context.
Indeed. I couldn't have done it without the pictures. I actually had once a New York collector friend who came to the house just before we started the actual hanging, and so he saw only the pictures, the photographs on the walls, and so when he left, he said, "Well, thank you. It was great seeing your poster collection." So this is my study where I'm sitting right now. Here you see my two latest acquisitions, two Dutch seascapes by Van de Capelle and Porcellus, and called this slide branching out, because indeed more and more now I'm collecting other works that I feel relate to the collection but are not in the core focus of Antwerp paintings. And my other growing interest is in sculpture, in whether it's Renaissance bronzes or here.
I was interested in buying that Van de Capelle for the National Gallery.
It is relatively similar. It's not quite the same quality, but it's relatively similar. Yeah. So the house is obviously a historic house which we restored, but it's also it shouldn't be a living museum. It shouldn't be just period rooms. So in terms of how we decorate the house, and here you see wonderful Snyder's still life, but we try to furnish it with mostly modern furniture, so that it's a house where you can really live well today, and that you don't have the sense that you are just moving around in a museum. And some of the rooms are really also on purpose art free or almost art free, because first of all, my children at the time when we moved into the house, there were still two of the children who were living there, didn't want to be confronted with paintings everywhere, and they wanted to have some 16th or 17th century free spaces, and it was very good of them to do that, because I think it gives you a sense of no, I don't find the word. I would almost say a breathing space, so that you can you can also live in much more contemporary surroundings. Luckily, the house is large, and so you can have many different spaces.
Yeah.
So finally, it was already referred to. We've delved into the history of the house, and I had two young scholars, Martin Bassens and Timothy de Pape, actually going back into the history of the house, and they really wrote a biography of the place. And it's a house that first was, as you can see it on the picture on the left, was a real 16th, 17th, early 17th century townhouse. It was remodeled. As you can see, the garden facade is more Rococo, so it's underwent many transformations. And the interesting thing is that we really found backstories about all the owners since 1600. It's been in 7 or 8 different families that have successively owned the house, and we found stories about each and every one of them. About some we know a lot, some were aristocrats, some were patricians, people in local politics. One was a real crook, as it turned out. It then turned out into in the last family moved out in 1930. It then became temporarily a convent as well. And then it was turned into a boutique hotel. And so in the 1970s, 1980s, it was actually a boutique hotel. It was a very trendy place at the time to stay in Antwerp. And we still have the guest books. And so if you go to the guest books, you will find that Liza Minnelli, Tina Turner, Elton John, and many other great names, actually, when they came to Antwerp, that's where they stayed. But one of the nice discoveries in that we made in the book, and that is very topical here today, is that actually it was owned by a sister of the wife of Henri Joseph Stier. So it was referred to into the presentation. He was married with a Marie-Louise Peters, and what is referred to as the Stier collection should actually more correctly be referred to as the Peters collection, because it was the collection of the father of his wife originally, and he had 4 daughters, and one married Henri Joseph Stier. The other married the father of the owner of my house. So actually, unfortunately, that part of the family wasn't apparently so much interested in the art collection, so it went to the Stiers, and also after coming back from the States, they didn't want to retrieve it. But there's actually in the book
such a great connection
of that link.
such a great connection between you and your house and the Riversdale collection and the early history of Flemish art in America. It's amazing.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. What for me was most striking, and all the credit goes to the authors of the book, how much you can find. As I say, it's a 200 or 300 pages book. It could have been longer because there's so much archival material still retained in city archives in Antwerp and elsewhere. And so you can piece together these lives, and there's actually many connections in the book to paintings in the collection or other well-known paintings. It was, for example, owned also by a descendant of Joris Vezele, who was himself painted by Jos van Cleven. These two wonderful double portraits in the National Gallery. So their great grandson also actually owned the house at a certain period of time. So there's many connections to be made and to be discovered, and so it was a fascinating journey of discovery. Maybe the greatest discovery in a way when we did the book was about this painting. You may have picked it up. It's a painting by Peter Thijs of the Van der Werve family. It hangs in the drawing room, and I had bought it actually early on when I bought the house, and when I bought it at Maastricht from Otto Naumann, we knew the sitter. It was Philip van der Werve and his wife and children, and so we knew it was an Antwerp aristocratic family, and so I thought it would fit very well into the house. But then, lo and behold, when the book is being written, the author at a certain stage comes to me and says, "Look, I have an exciting discovery. I now know who was the second owner of the house, because the first one we had known all along. It was a family from Marcelaar, but he said, well, we have a name now, and we have found some archival material that we know the second owner, and this is Philip van der Werve," he said. And he said, "I have even greater news for you. We even have a photograph here of a portrait of this gentleman." And he showed me this, and I said, "Well, I bought that a couple of months ago, that painting." So what a fantastic coincidence. I didn't, as I said, I didn't know at that time there was a connection to the house. I maybe sensed it, but I'm very glad I didn't know, because if I had known, I probably wouldn't have been able to hide my excitement, and it would have cost me twice the money.
Thomas, thank you so much. What a great story. Really appreciate you sharing all that with us. And Louisa, I guess we're back to you.
Yes, thank you so much. That was wonderful. We have quite a few questions that have already been answered by the panelists. So if everyone wants to look in the Q&A for those answers, and we have a few for the collector, and Samantha's going to start with those for Mr. Leysen.
Great. So I have a question. The first question for you, Thomas, is, are there any artists of the 20th century or even 21st who you might be interested in collecting as a complement to your Flemish master collection?
Well, it's not totally, I wouldn't be able easily to pin names on it, because my relation or my reaction to an artwork is very instinctive, and I sometimes like it and I don't like it. And it's not that I have 5 artists which I say these would really work well. It's when I see a work of art that I have either this connection or not. In terms of 20th century artists, I have work by Morandi, which is a painter I particularly like. I've some contemporary art by, for example, a well-known Flemish painter, Luc Tuymans now, because I think he's a very interesting painter. So it's more instinctive, and it's not a well-defined number of artists.
Okay, and I think there's one more question for you, Thomas. Sorry, Louisa. And that was whether or not if you had a virtual tour of the current exhibition of Flemish portraits. It came in during your time, so.
Sorry, I'm not sure I totally got that
I
question.
don't get it. Louisa, do you understand that question?
It says, do you have a virtual tour of the current exhibition of Flemish portraits in your house?
Probably it refers to the exhibition that is in the Rocox house currently, which is called Blind Date, and it is a collection. It's a collection by another Antwerp-based collector. There is certainly a good catalog. I think there is not a fully developed virtual tour, but I think on the KBC Rocox House website you will find some material about the exhibition, and you will be able to sample it there. And certainly you can request a catalog.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. I think mostly all of the other questions have been answered, and we are over time. So I think that perhaps we should end our wonderful afternoon here. This was marvelous. Thank you to all the panelists for all your input, your discussion. It was really lively. Even though I was in the original symposium, I've learned a whole lot more today than I did then. And just really thanks to all of you. And again, to Ian for supporting us, Stephen Barry, the director of the Art Reference Library, to Esmée, and to the government of Flanders. So thank you all very much for this wonderful thing. And do buy the book with the discount code if you attended today, and enjoy this rich collection of paintings. Thank you.